Harvey Milk was a trailblazing politician and activist with a charismatic and fearless personality. In 1977, he became California's first openly gay elected official and became a powerful voice for marginalized communities. But on the morning of November 27, 1978, Harvey's life was cut short just 1 year into his term when he and Mayor George Moscone became the target of a shocking act of violence. Hey guys, and welcome to the Moms and Mysteries podcast, a true crime podcast featuring myself, Mandy, and my dear friend, Melissa. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Mandy. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. Barely by a thread. I have back problems. They just developed overnight. Is that...
Are
they going to go away?
Eventually they'll go away, but they'll come back and then, go away and come back. You look amazing, but you're getting older.
Wow.
And
thank you.
I started it with a compliment.
That's like the criticism sandwich or whatever they say.
I didn't even end it on a positive. I just said you're getting older. But aging is a gift. So
it is.
So you just woke up.
No,
and it was painful?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't know exactly. I can't pinpoint exactly when it started. All I know, because I didn't really take notice that it was like an ongoing thing until it had been ongoing for a couple of days. So now I think I'm on day 3 or maybe 4, but it's just the weirdest thing. It's just in my upper back. I feel like I don't know how to explain it. It feels like the pain is underneath my skin, but then for some reason, the top of my skin also feels bruised, but everything looks totally normal and fine back there. It doesn't look like anything's wrong. It's just very tight and just, I don't know. It's really weird, but it almost feels like a burning sensation. But the weirdest thing about this is that, like, what has been driving me crazy is that even wearing clothes, like, I can feel my skin is so sensitive in that one area, and I can feel like my clothes even bother it. And if I don't know, it's driving me crazy. If I sit down for too long, it starts to act up. If I stand up for too long, it starts to act up. So yeah, this whole week I've just been like up and down. I've missed a couple of my very precious morning walks because of this. And yeah, it's been really serious. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means for me. Is this it?
You'll figure it out. No, I hope not. I hope things end better for you than that. Well, Mandy, I know your back isn't feeling great, but you know what is going to be feeling great?
What?
Your heart. And it's going to be so full because this Wednesday, March 19th, if you're in Central Florida, we are hosting a private pre-screening of the new Nicole Kidman movie, Holland. It's like a true crime mystery
thriller.
So pumped. Thriller.
Yeah.
Did you the preview actually kind of freaked me out? Like I'm so excited.
This movie is right up my alley. This type of movie is right up my alley. I am so excited to be a part of this and to be doing it.
I know.
And yeah, it's definitely something we've never done before, but it's very fun. Yeah, there's a lot more details about all of that on our Instagram page, but it's something that we're doing in person here in our local area. So we are going to be at a movie theater watching a pre-release screening of this movie Holland on Wednesday, November 9th.
Nope, not November.
Where am I going with that? Wednesday, March 19th.
All the information's in our Instagram, but it's a free movie. It's free concessions. The only thing we need from you is your firstborn. No, just kidding. The only thing we need from you is to sign up. And so we have all that on our Instagram. If you have questions, just DM us. But literally, when you hear this, it'll be the next day. So you gotta do it quickly. There's limited seats, all that. But please join us if you can. But please sign up to join us.
Yes.
Definitely. So we have a seat for you.
Perfect. All right. Well, we will get right into the story this week. There's quite a bit to get into here. This is a really wild story, but I always love when we can get a little bit of a crime story mixed with a little bit of a history lesson. That always is fascinating to me.
Absolutely.
So Harvey Bernard Milk was born on May 22nd, 1930 in Woodmere, New York. He was born into a middle-class Jewish family that was deeply rooted in community and civic engagement. In other words, a lot of people in the family were involved in politics. Harvey's father, William, was a Lithuanian immigrant who served in the U.S. Navy, and his mom, Minerva, was a World War I yeomanette, which is a woman who served in the Navy during World War I. These were actually the first women to ever enlist in the Navy.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. The Milk family was well known in New York's Litvak Jewish community, partly because the family owned a department store there called Milk's, which I don't know why. I just don't like that as a name for a store.
No, I mean, I guess a dairy store, it's
Right.
probably
I get
pretty on
it.
brand.
Obviously, their last name is Milk, but you don't have to use your last name in your store name.
Guess what? People knew them because of it, so it
That's
worked.
true. That's true. But that wasn't the only reason that the family was well known. It was also partly because they had founded a local synagogue. Harvey and his brother Robert worked together in the family business. By the time Harvey was in high school, he knew that he was gay, but he kept it private and he just tried to blend in. Harvey was a popular student with a wide range of interests, from opera to playing football and everything in between. After high school, Harvey went on to the New York State College for Teachers, where he studied math and history. At the university, he wrote a column for the student newspaper where he tackled issues of diversity and reflected on the lessons to be learned from World War I. In 1951, Harvey enlisted in the Navy and trained as a diving instructor in San Diego. But his military career was sadly cut short in 1955 when officials started to question Harvey's sexuality. He eventually resigned at the rank of lieutenant junior grade. As Harvey transitioned back into civilian life, he bounced between careers. First, he taught at a public school on Long Island and worked as a Wall Street stock analyst, and then he also even helped produce Broadway hits like Hair and Jesus Christ Superstar, which I didn't see that one coming.
I didn't.
I mean, maybe we just didn't get that in the research about him having a passion for theater arts or things like that. But that one kind of threw me for a loop. I was like, where did that come from? How did he just get involved in Broadway productions? That is really neat. But the political shifts in the 1960s pulled Harvey in a different direction. He became more and more vocal against the Vietnam War, and he started really making a name for himself as an activist. By late 1972, Harvey was ready for a change. He packed up and moved to San Francisco and lived in a growing gay community known as the Castro. He opened a small camera store there, which soon became more than just a business. It was a gathering place, a campaign headquarters, and just really this hub of activism. Harvey quickly and effortlessly became a well-known figure in the neighborhood. Just over a year later, he launched his first campaign for the city's Board of Supervisors. He actually lost the race, but things weren't over for him. His humor, boldness, and that unwavering belief in equality for all had really put him on the map, and the locals were starting to take notice.
By the mid-1970s, Harvey wasn't just a local activist. He was truly becoming a force in the San Francisco area. When a few business owners in the Castro tried to block two gay men from opening a shop, Harvey saw an opportunity for the community to come together. He and other business leaders founded the Castro Village Association, which was the first organization in the U.S. to be made up mostly of LGBT-owned businesses. As a president of the association, Harvey worked to strengthen the community's economic and political power and to prove that the Castro wasn't just a place to live, it was a movement. In 1974, Harvey launched the first ever Castro Street Fair to attract customers to local shops, and it was a hit. Thousands of visitors actually came, and the Castro Village Association took hold. Other cities with growing gay communities started to notice and tried to replicate Harvey's model to build their own networks of influence. So at this time, Harvey was determined to take things to the next level. So he actually decided to run for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors again in 1975. This time, he was actually so incredibly close to winning, but he ultimately fell short of the needed votes. His near victory cemented him as the unofficial spokesperson for the thriving gay community of the Castro. Eventually, Harvey had drawn enough attention to himself and to his mission, and the newly elected Mayor George Moscone had noticed. Mayor Moscone was a strong ally of LGBT rights, and he really liked what he saw in Harvey and wanted him to work for the city. So Harvey was appointed to the city's Board of Permit Appeals, making him the first openly gay city commissioner in the United States. Harvey, however, was not satisfied with being appointed. He wanted to actually be elected by the people. He soon filed papers to run for the California State Assembly, but that campaign ended with another tough loss. And that's when he and his campaign manager, a woman by the name of Ann Cronenberg, really took a hard look at the way the system was set up. Running a citywide race was really a challenge, but if Harvey could rally the Castro and other progressive neighborhoods, then his chances would greatly improve. Mayor Moscone supported Harvey in pushing for his district elections, which gave local communities more control over who represented them. When the new system went into effect, everything changed. In 1977, on Harvey's third attempt, he was finally elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. This was a historic win and a deeply personal one for Harvey, as it symbolized a breakthrough in LGBT representation.
Harvey Milk was inaugurated on January 9th, 1978. He made it clear that he was taking office as his true and authentic self, and he introduced Jack Lyra as, quote, my lover, my partner in life. News of his win made national and international headlines. It was the first time that a major American city had chosen an openly gay leader. But Harvey didn't just enter office only to serve the LGBTQ community. He truly wanted to make life better for all residents of San Francisco. In addition to fighting for civil rights, he also stood behind working moms and advocated for daycare centers. And he pushed for converting abandoned military sites into affordable housing and for tax reforms that could revive struggling industries and bring jobs back to the city. Harvey pressured the mayor to invest in safer neighborhoods and better policing, and he expanded library services for the Castro neighborhood. Of course, though, he never lost sight of one of his biggest fights, and that was the fight for equality. In 1978, a statewide ballot initiative called Proposition 6 threatened to force all gay teachers and their supporters out of California's public schools, and Harvey wasn't going to stand by and idly let that happen. On June 25th that year, he took the stage at the San Francisco Freedom Day Parade and delivered one of the most powerful speeches of his career. He opened the speech with a call to action for citizens to fight to preserve democracy by rejecting politicians who wanted to constitutionalize bigotry. Harvey also challenged and empowered members of the LGBTQ community to make their voices heard and to come forward and speak out for the sake of the community. He felt that visibility was really key, and if people saw that it was their friends, family, and neighbors who were gay, it would be harder for them to believe the lies that were fueling this discrimination. With Harvey leading the opposition, Proposition 6 was defeated. At the time, there were similar anti-gay laws passing across the country, so Harvey's victory in California really proved that these types of political attacks on the LGBTQ community could be fought and could be beaten. But being outspoken came at a price. Harvey started getting more and more threats. Some were through anonymous phone calls, while others came in chilling letters. Harvey was reminded constantly that people out there wanted him dead, and he was well aware of the risk and the target on his back. So Harvey prepared. He recorded several versions of his will that were to be played only in the event of his assassination. But no matter what, he refused to back down.
While Harvey had spent his first year in office fighting for the people of San Francisco and pushing forward a vision that extended beyond LGBTQ rights, not everyone was on board with the change that he represented. In fact, one of his strongest opponents sat just a few seats away from Harvey on the Board of Supervisors, and that was a man by the name of Dan White. Dan and Harvey really couldn't have been more different. Dan was born and raised in San Francisco and had built a life of service, but his approach to leadership was pretty much the opposite of what Harvey envisioned. Dan was a Vietnam veteran with 3 medals, and he served as a police officer before taking a break to hitchhike around the country. Mandy, does that sound like a thing you'd want to do?
No, it does sound like a very 1960s, 70s thing to do,
Absolutely.
But it does not sound like a very 2025 thing to do.
No, I would agree with you. So he spent some time in Alaska, where he worked as a high school guidance counselor, and then in 1973, he returned to San Francisco and joined the local fire department. In 1977, Dan was elected to the Board of Supervisors as a staunch conservative, and this was around the same time that Harvey was elected. Dan was supported and heavily backed by the police, fire unions, and his district, which consisted primarily of white middle-class families. His supporters were deeply resistant to the city's growing gay community, and Dan was very clear with where he stood. He saw himself as the board's defender of what he thought were the traditional values involving home, family, and religious life. Dan saw Harvey's views on gay rights, the drug culture, and the changing social norms as a threat to these quote-unquote traditional values. But Harvey pressed on, undeterred, and continued pushing the city towards inclusivity and equal rights. He also championed social programs that benefited the working class. So, as you can imagine, he and Dan often clashed. At the time, the Board of Supervisors had a conservative majority, but with Mayor George Moscone backing Harvey's vision, there was deep frustration on both sides. While Harvey and the mayor were determined to move forward with more progressive reforms, Dan and his allies worked to block many of the mayor's proposed initiatives.
In November of 1978, Dan White made a shocking announcement. At a press conference, he spoke about financial struggles that he'd been facing since leaving his job as a firefighter. The pay cut he took on to actually be on the Board of Supervisors was too steep, and he and his wife were struggling to make ends meet now. He had started a potato stand at Pier 39 to supplement their income, but the hours were long and it was really starting to take a toll on them. I'm not sure I know what a potato stand is, but it sounds like something that we need to bring back.
Yeah, if it's like, imagine if it's just potatoes made in different ways. Fries,
I hope
chips.
that's exactly what it is. I honestly hope that's what it is. In fact, Dan kind of described it just that way. He had a quote where he said, "My wife and I are forced to work 60 hours a week cutting French fries, and I can't give my constituents the 100% job I'd like to." So while that is unfortunate and sad, I'm still intrigued by the potato stand. And is it just French fries? Is it, like you said, is it other types of potatoes?
Twice baked potatoes.
I need to know.
Loaded mashed potatoes. Oh my gosh. Endless.
So Mayor Moscone was surprised to hear that Dan was resigning. You know, they had always been at odds when it came to politics, but the mayor still saw Dan as a dedicated public servant and said he was very sorry to see him go. But now that Dan's seat was vacant, the mayor had the power to appoint a replacement, and he promised to make an announcement on who would take that seat very soon. After the conference, Dan sent an official resignation letter to Mayor Moscone stating that he was proud to have represented the people for 10 months, but that he was resigning due to personal responsibilities. Days later, though, on the 14th, Dan had second thoughts, and he called the mayor and asked if he could withdraw his resignation and be reinstated on the Board of Supervisors. Mayor Moscone was surprised, but he was open to the idea, only if it were legally possible. He told Dan that he would contact the city attorney to find out more. The next morning, Mayor Moscone called Dan back with an answer. He would be allowed to return to his seat on the board. So at this point, Dan really feels that he needs to justify his reasons for reversing his decision to resign, and he told the media that his constituents had urged him to stay and said that leaving would harm their district, and they didn't want a new representative. Dan's family had also evidently stepped in to help with the potato stand, and they offered to even lend him money if it was finances that were the issue for him. The mayor appeared supportive of Dan and told reporters that he had never wanted to see a young man forced out in the first place and that Dan's district was in good hands with him. The mayor even said that if any legal issue were to come up, he would simply just reappoint Dan to his old position.
But as his legal review began to unfold, things were less certain. On November 16th, the chief deputy city attorney publicly cast doubt on whether the resignation could be undone or if reappointing Dan would even be legal. He asked that Dan and the mayor give the city attorney's office a week to sort things out and to look into the legalities of it. By the 17th, the decision was made. Dan's resignation would be final. The mayor announced that he legally could not revoke it, though he was still considering reappointing Dan to the seat. Dan seemed confident that he would be reappointed, and on November 20th, he sent another letter to Mayor Moscone where he wrote, quote, "Your stated willingness to reappoint me to my own position, if it becomes legally necessary, is much appreciated," end quote. But the mayor wrote back and told him that no such promise had been made. He said, quote, "As I told you this past Saturday, I have received a great many communications from the residents of your district, some from your public opponents, other from your past supporters, which have urged me not to reappoint you to the Board of Supervisors," end quote. But the mayor again said he would take another week to mull it over and review the situation, but he made no commitment to place Dan back on the board. By the 21st, the battle over Dan's seat was reaching a breaking point, and the pressure was mounting. Behind closed doors, other board members were pleading with the mayor not to reinstate Dan, pointing to his conservative voting record, which had made it difficult to pass progressive legislation. They wanted the mayor to appoint someone with liberal ideals instead, and that would allow them to shift the balance of power on the board. They saw this as an opportunity to create change. Eventually, Mayor Moscone addressed the press and admitted that he did have some serious reservations and just wasn't sure if it would be the best idea to reappoint Dan White. In the days that followed, the city attorney made a final ruling. Dan's resignation was legally binding and there was no path for which he could return to his seat on the board. Dan refused to accept this decision, and he publicly declared that he rejected this ruling and insisted that he was still the rightful supervisor of District 8. But the mayor stood firm and reassured everyone that Dan's arguments had no legal merit and that a new supervisor would be appointed on Monday, November 27th, at a press conference that was scheduled for 11:30 a.m. Dan still didn't know who was going to be taking his seat, but on the night of Sunday, November 26th, so this is just the day before, sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., he got a call from a reporter who said that she heard from a reliable source that Dan was not going to be reappointed, and she wanted to know if he would give her an interview. Dan had nothing to say to this, and he hung up the phone. But unbeknownst to Dan White, the mayor had already chosen to replace him with Dan Ramsey. But history didn't get the chance to play out the way Mayor Moscone hoped. On the morning of November 27th, 1978, offices in City Hall were bustling with activity as staff members prepared for the workday ahead. But outside, Dan White was making his own preparations, ones that would alter history forever. And we have so much more to get into with this story, and we'll do that after a quick break to hear a word from this week's sponsors. Hey guys, if you're in Central Florida and are hearing this on or before March 19th, 2025, head to our show notes right now to get your free ticket to join Mandy and I for a special pre-release screening of the new Amazon original movie, Holland. So if you haven't heard of Holland, Holland is this wildly unpredictable thriller that the lovely Nicole Kidman stars in. She plays this meticulous, picture-perfect housewife whose picture-perfect life really tumbles into this twisted tale, and she and one of her colleagues actually become very suspicious of a secret, only to discover that nothing in their lives in Holland, Michigan is actually what it seems. It sounds so good, and Mandy and I cannot wait to watch it with you. There's limited seating available, so make sure you grab your spot right now. You can actually sign up through the link in our show notes while tickets are still available. You can also find all the information on our Instagram page, and that will also be linked. And we hope to see you there for a night of entertainment. There's free entry and, of course, movie magic. March 19th, don't miss it. Hey guys, wanted to tell you a little about an incredible purchase I got from Wayfair. Last summer, actually, I got some new outdoor furniture from Wayfair, and let me tell you, it's a total game changer for my backyard. I went with these gorgeous but ultra comfortable chairs and this stunning umbrella that really helps keep me cool all summer long. If you've been on the hunt for chic and practical outdoor furniture, oh my gosh, you will love all the options that Wayfair has. And the quality is really insane. They've actually been outside all year long and they still look like I just bought them. I love furniture that's not only beautiful, but comfy. So these chairs are perfect for my style and for my back. The delivery was so quick, I think I got it the next day. Plus, Wayfair has an incredible selection of outdoor furniture like patio sets, fire pits, which I also got from Wayfair earlier this year, and even fun little garden gnomes. Whether you're looking for something to style your yard or just to add a few touches to your porch, Wayfair makes it easy to find exactly what you need. Seriously, their variety of styles and prices means you can find something for any budget or taste. And the best part? The delivery was free. It doesn't get more convenient than that. Head over to wayfair.com and find something that's just your style today. That's WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair. Every style, every home. And now back to the episode.
Before the break, we were getting into the story of Harvey Milk, who was a pretty well-known and popular activist in California in the 1970s. And he had a seat on the Board of Supervisors during the time that George Moscone was the mayor. During this time, Harvey and Mayor Moscone weren't really seeing eye to eye with another member of the Board of Supervisors named Dan White, who had actually recently resigned from his position and wanted to be reinstated back to the board. Dan fought hard for weeks to try and reclaim his seat on the Board of Supervisors, but on the morning of November 27th, he finally snapped. Dan loaded his .38 special revolver and slipped it into a holster and took 10 additional bullets with him in his pocket. Then, at approximately 10 a.m., he called his aide and asked for a ride to City Hall. The aide picked Dan up from his home and dropped him off at the front entrance to City Hall, but Dan knew he couldn't go through the front door because there were metal detectors and he was carrying a gun. So Dan walked to the basement level entrance that was actually off of another street, but he found that the door was locked for security reasons. So he just hung out there for a few minutes contemplating his next move, and then Dan made his decision. At that point, there was no turning back. He climbed through the window of an engineer's office and snuck into the building undetected. Inside, Dan moved quickly. He passed through a small laboratory room where he was actually spotted by a staff member, but he identified himself as Supervisor White and just continued walking as if nothing were out of the ordinary and like he had every reason and right to be there. Dan moved up to the first floor and then the second floor where the offices of the mayor and the Board of Supervisors were located. At around 10:40 a.m., Dan approached the desk of Mayor Moscone's secretary. Anyone who wanted to see the mayor had to go through her first. Of course, Dan didn't have an appointment, but it wasn't uncommon for supervisors to just stop by unannounced at times to see the mayor. He exchanged small talk with the mayor's secretary, and then he asked if he would be able to see the mayor. Even though the mayor has this important announcement that he's already scheduled to be making at 11:30 via press conference, the mayor agreed to see Dan White. This was a decision that would ultimately cost him his life.
So Dan stepped into the mayor's main office where the conversation quickly became hostile and tense, with their voices growing louder and louder until the mayor suggested they move into a quieter, more private office. Mayor Moscone poured 2 drinks, one for himself and one for Dan. And of course, he was doing this in the hopes of easing the tension, but neither of the men would touch their drinks. As they talked, something shifted in Dan and everything really came to a boiling point. He reached for the revolver that he had brought with him, and just like that, he fired 2 shots into Mayor Moscone's body, causing him to drop to the floor. Dan then raised the gun and fired 2 more rounds into the right side of the mayor's head. After murdering the mayor in cold blood, Dan quickly headed down the hallway on a mission to find Harvey Milk. When the mayor's deputy noticed the way Dan was hurrying out of the mayor's office, he went in to check on things and found the mayor's lifeless body. Meanwhile, Dan was moving towards the west side of the building, where the offices for the Board of Supervisors were located. He made his way to Harvey's office, and he peeked inside. And Harvey was in there. He was sitting with his volunteer legislative aide. Dan asked Harvey if they could talk for a moment, and Harvey, who had no reason to suspect he was in any danger, said sure. So Dan led Harvey down the hall to his own former office and shut the door behind them. About 15 seconds later, Harvey could be heard yelling, "Oh no," before a series of gunshots rang out. Dan shot Harvey 3 times in the body, and as he collapsed to the floor, he was shot twice more in the back of the head. After shooting Harvey, Dan stepped out of his office and rushed down the hallway. Shortly after 11 a.m., he burst through the door of his aide's office and shouted for her to give him her car keys. Then he ran out of City Hall and he escaped. After the assassinations, Dan called his wife and asked her to meet him at a cathedral. They walked together in silence to a nearby police station where Dan turned himself in. But not just to any officer, to a very specific officer that he knew he could trust. The police then seized his revolver, and it was later confirmed that the shots that killed both the mayor and Harvey Milk were fired from Dan's gun.
Shortly after his arrest, Dan was read his Miranda rights, and he sat down to give a statement at 12:05 p.m. Investigators asked Dan to explain what had happened and why he murdered 2 men and then fled the scene, only to surrender himself at a police station shortly thereafter. Dan started by explaining the increasing pressure he'd been feeling and the financial struggles, the stress on his family, and just the weight of losing his seat on the Board of Supervisors. Dan described his dedication to the people of District 8 and how he had initially resigned because of these pressures, but later he felt a duty to return. His friends and family had rallied behind him, and they wanted to support him however they could. But then the conversation turned to his frustration with the mayor and with Harvey Milk. Dan said the mayor had been supportive of him at first and had even complimented him as a supervisor and a valuable member of the board, but then he learned that Harvey and others were actually actively working against his reappointment and had been making accusations and really just painting Dan in a negative light in the media. The police pressed Dan about his meetings with the mayor, and Dan admitted that he actually hadn't spoken to the mayor in over a week at that point. And at the time that they did talk, the mayor told Dan that he had to prove that he still had public support if he wanted to get his seat on the board back.
I feel like this isn't the way you do that.
Yeah. Probably
right?
not. Yeah, that's not following the advice you were given. So Dan didn't do that probably because he didn't think that was even the real issue. He thought they were trying to just use him as a scapegoat and that they were willing to just hang him out to dry and leave his family in a crisis. Again, I don't know why he thought that, but that's what he says he thought. So Dan said that as the week dragged on, it became clear that the mayor had already chosen someone else for the position. And so, of course, Dan's upset because in his view, the mayor had promised to call him, before making a decision. He thought him and the mayor were really close, that the mayor would never do something like this to him. So he just felt very betrayed when he found out that he was, in fact, not getting his seat on the board back. On the 27th, which is the morning that the mayor is supposed to be delivering a press conference announcing who is going to be filling the seat, Dan decides to just go down to City Hall in person. He claimed that he didn't have any thought-out plan and he was just going down there to talk to the mayor, but then he was in his home, he went down to the basement, and he saw his revolver. And this is the same gun that he used when he was a police officer.
Dan said the morning was pretty straightforward. He left his house and went to City Hall with his gun in tow. The aide that drove him had no idea he was concealing a weapon on his hip. He told her that he was just going to talk to the mayor to find out more about why he wasn't going to reappoint him. But Dan said that the mayor didn't give him the answer he wanted to hear. Instead, he bluntly stated that Dan would not be reappointed. To add insult to injury, the mayor wasn't going to tell Dan this personally. He was going to just announce it at the press conference later that morning. Dan said that the mayor suggested they go back into the room to have a drink and just to talk about everything. After hearing that so many people opposed his return to the board, Dan tried to insist that the majority of his district did in fact support him, but it really didn't matter. Dan said that this was a political decision and that was the end of it. When the mayor noticed that Dan was becoming more upset and distraught, he offered him a drink. But at that point, Dan said that nothing was even registering. He could hear the mayor talking, but it wasn't getting through. Dan explained that he felt like his mind was racing and his ears were roaring, and he said his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He was worried about the mayor going out and telling the press that he wasn't a good supervisor and that the people didn't want him. Dan said, quote, "That was it. Then I just shot him. That was it. It was over," end quote. So after shooting the mayor, Dan stepped out of the room and happened to see Harvey Milk's aide across the hall. And he said that it was in that moment that his rage shifted. He had planned to flee after killing the mayor, but he remembered what Harvey had tried to do to him, blocking his reappointment. And he also knew that Harvey had been scheming against him. Dan said he wanted to go talk to Harvey. He said, quote, "At least maybe he'll be honest with me," end quote. Dan said that Harvey greeted him with a smile when he came into his office, but that Dan was still highly upset and just wanted Harvey to explain himself. But then Dan said that Harvey was smirking at him, and he felt like this was just because Harvey knew Dan wasn't getting appointed, and now he was just basically mocking him. Of course, this is Dan's interpretation of these events, of course. Dan said that he just, quote, "got all flushed and hot," end quote, and that he shot 5 times at Harvey before fleeing in his aide's car.
The officers asked Dan where he went next, and he struggled to answer. He explained that he drove to a diner and then called his wife, and he didn't tell her what happened at first. He just asked her to meet him at St. Mary's Cathedral, and she then took a cab to meet him there. When his wife arrived, Dan confessed what he had done. He said that his wife kind of just slumped over and really couldn't say anything, but she didn't abandon him. Instead, she got up and walked to the police station with him where he turned himself in. Dan's wife told him she loved him and asked him to please not hurt himself, and she said that she promised to stand by him. As the interview was wrapping up, Dan was asked if he wanted to add anything else, and he said, "Just that I've always been honest and worked hard. I'm not a crook or anything. I wanted to do a good job, and I saw this city as going kind of downhill, and I just couldn't take it anymore, and that's it." Dan said that he wasn't under a doctor's care and wasn't on any medication. When officers pressed him for more information about the roaring in his ears that he was describing just before the shooting of the mayor, Dan said he had experienced that before when he was under significant pressure at home and had been having trouble sleeping at night. They asked him if carrying a gun was something he did regularly since he left the police force and becoming a supervisor on the board, and he said that he had carried a gun in the past due to threats against his life, but he admitted that he had not carried his gun for months. But still, he insisted that when he left home with his gun that morning, he only intended to talk to the mayor. At that point, he said he didn't even know for sure whether or not he would be reappointed, and he just wanted to go down there and talk. Dan maintained that he never really intended to hurt anyone. The interview concluded at 12:30 that afternoon, but that was far from being the end of it. Dan was charged with 2 counts of murder, as well as the use of firearms and being armed with a deadly weapon. He was also charged with interfering with official duties of Mayor Moscone and a supervisor. Prosecutors were seeking the death penalty against Dan.
The city of San Francisco was still expecting this press conference to happen that morning, that one where the mayor was going to announce Dan White's replacement on the Board of Supervisors. But instead, the reporters that gathered were met with a visibly shaken Dianne Feinstein, who was the president of the Board of Supervisors. Dianne welled up with tears as she spoke to the media and informed the public that Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk had been shot and killed, and that the suspect in their murders was Supervisor Dan White. Dianne stepped into the role of acting mayor and ordered official days of mourning for the 2 victims. When it came time to appoint a new person to fill Harvey's seat on the board, she chose Harry Britt Jr., a gay activist, to carry on Harvey's work. A spontaneous crowd of nearly 25,000 people ended up gathering in the Castro to march to City Hall, but instead of filling the air with chants and protests, the group walked in silence and carried candles. I'm always fascinated by anything that can be done in a group before social media.
Oh, in a group. I thought you were going to say like that.
They're both shocking.
Yeah.
But having that many people get together back then, in this sort of spontaneous
it's
way,
all
but
word
you're
of
right
mouth,
too.
But yeah.
Mm-hmm. The assassinations sent shockwaves across the country. People as far as Washington, D.C. were gathering in large crowds in support of gay rights and chanting, "Harvey Milk lives." But as the city of San Francisco mourned, the divide between the city's police force and its liberal community grew deeper. There was already tension between these 2 groups as many local officers resented and rejected the progressive turn that things were taking in the city. And some had even openly expressed their distaste for Harvey Milk. Now, in the wake of his murder, some officers actually doubled down on their stance by wearing shirts that said, "Free Dan White." Those who knew Dan were stunned and really couldn't believe that he would commit such a brutal crime. He was described as being reliable, someone who really never seemed excitable or nervous, but to others, this actually wasn't that surprising at all. Dan's own assistant told the media that he was impulsive and did things very quickly. Another politician said that Dan was an obsessively competitive man who liked all the macho sports like boxing and football. He said that Dan even had a paratrooper mentality, which, leave a comment if you know what that actually means. I haven't heard of that.
One tripped me up. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And so we have more to get into, including the case against Dan White, after a quick break to hear a word from this week's sponsors. So the temperatures are rising, which is a good and a bad thing for me. But the last thing I want is to feel sweaty with a bra just clinging to me. That's why I love Honey Love. Their shapewear is a total game changer, as well as their bra, just everything they have. It's so breathable, it's flexible, and it actually works with your body, not against it. Shapewear for me is normally a 4-letter word, but not with Honey Love. I actually wore it to a wedding in Sarasota a few months ago, and it was on the beach, and it felt so good. It fit perfectly, and I felt like I actually looked good. I wasn't dying to rip it off at the end of the night, which is truly a first for shapewear. But what I really love about Honey Love is that it works for every body type. Honey Love gives you that custom support where you need it without squeezing your natural curves. There's no more stiff, restrictive shapewear that has you adjusting every few minutes, which is why this Superpower Short is a total must-have. It gives me that lifted look with boost bands on the back of the thighs, and the cotton gusset and easy access designs means there are no bathroom hassles. And you can't forget about the piece that really started my love affair with Honey Love, and that's their crossover bra. It's literally a bra you'll forget you have on. Treat yourself to the most comfortable shapewear on earth and save 20% off site-wide at honeylove.com/moms20. Use our exclusive link to get 20% off, honeylove.com/moms20. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Treat yourself to Honey Love because you deserve it. When I think about a woman who truly inspires not only my makeup look, but my life, the first person that comes to mind is my mom. My mom is honestly the definition of beauty, not just because she has flawless skin, but because of the way her beauty radiates from within. She's always kept it pretty simple when it comes to makeup, and I've definitely tried to embrace that myself, as well as how she shows love and cares for other people. She's just the best. And when I think of simple beauty, I think of both my mom and Thrive Cosmetics. One of the things I truly love about Thrive Cosmetics and what really sets them apart from others is that with every product purchase, they don't just help you feel and look amazing, they actually give back. Thrive donates both products and funds to help communities thrive, and that's something I can really stand behind. A very close family member is actually battling cancer right now, and so I love knowing that the products I buy are also supporting causes like cancer that matter to her, but also to so many other people. And Thrive really gives back to so many different groups. And if you're looking for something to help you feel amazing and give back, you have to check out their Liquid Lash Extensions Mascara. Ever since I found it a few years ago, it's the only mascara I use. And what really sets it apart for me is the flake-free tubing formula that dramatically lengthens and defines your lashes from root to tip. It's such an easy win for me. Plus, with the flake-free tubing formula, I'm never left with raccoon eyes if I'm crying, which happens all the time. Knowing that Thrive Cosmetics is giving back to people who truly need it really just makes the mascara that much more special. Celebrate the women in your life with Thrive Cosmetics, luxury beauty that gives back. Right now, you can get an exclusive 20% off your first order at thrivecosmetics.com/moms. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/moms for 20% off your first order. Everyone says their kid will eat everything that they're supposed to eat, and there will be no exceptions. And I said the same thing back before I had kids, but boy, was I humbled when I had my son. It's been a battle since he was tiny to eat anything on the food pyramid that didn't start with a C and end with an ARB. In other words, he's always missing out on the nutrients he really needs from the food he's eating. But that's where Haya comes in. Haya's chewable vitamins have been a huge W in my household. Unlike those typical children's vitamins that are basically just candy filled with tons of sugar and unhealthy additives, Haya really hits different. There's no sugar, no gummy junk, just pure, clean nutrition that helps fill in the gaps in his diet. What I also love, and the only reason this works, is because they actually taste great. My son actually wants to take them, and that's saying something. Haya's formula is packed with 12 organic fruits and veggies and supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals like vitamin D, B12, and zinc. It supports everything from his immune system to his mood, his brain function, and even his teeth and bones. Plus, it's completely free from GMOs, dairy, nuts, and gelatin, so I know it's safe for him. Oh, also, Haya has a new Kids Daily Greens and Superfoods powder. It's chocolate flavored, packed with over 55 whole food ingredients, and it's designed specifically for kids to support brain power and digestion. I know digestion has been a huge thing in our house, literally since my son was little. This is huge for us. So all he has to do is scoop, shake, and sip it with milk or any other non-dairy beverage for a tasty and nutritious boost. With Haya, I'm not just crossing my fingers that he's getting the nutrients he needs. I know he is. We've worked out a special deal with Haya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hayahealth.com/moms. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hayahealth.com/moms and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And now back to the episode.
After weeks of fighting to regain his seat on the Board of Supervisors, Dan White had snapped on November 27th when he went to City Hall armed and he killed Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk and then fled before turning himself into the police. By the time Dan's trial began in May of 1979, the city was still reeling from the two assassinations. The question for the jury wasn't whether or not Dan had pulled the trigger. That part was already clear. Instead, the trial would hinge on why he did it. Prosecutors were prepared to argue that this was a case of first-degree, premeditated murder and that Dan had planned these killings and executed them with clear intentions. He brought a loaded gun, extra bullets, and he also entered City Hall through a basement window to avoid being detected by security. Then, he shot the mayor and Harvey Milk multiple times. The prosecution was firm in their opinion that this was a calculated murder and not a moment of emotional collapse. But Dan's defense took a different approach. They didn't deny that he was the one who killed the two men, but instead they claimed that he was acting under diminished capacity and that his mental state in the moment prevented him from being able to fully control his actions. Dan never took the stand himself, but his attorneys painted a picture of him as a man who'd been suffering from undiagnosed mental illness for years. They alleged that he had severe depression, possibly manic depression, and that it went beyond just ordinary sadness. They pointed to signs of Dan's depression, including drastic changes in his diet, difficulty sleeping, low energy, withdrawing from work and social life, and episodes of just really bizarre behavior. The defense claimed that Dan had dealt with these episodes throughout his life, but it had never been recognized for what it was because, according to the defense, Dan was a man who just never complained, so that's why no one ever noticed that he was struggling. Dan's attorneys described him as a working-class idealist who was deeply committed to traditional values of family, home, honesty, and fairness, and they even suggested that he may have been too fair in his politics in San Francisco. They said Dan just wasn't cut out for the political world where people lied and played dirty to get things done. He was someone who had always trusted people and believed that a man's word was his bond, and that in the end, he was left feeling betrayed, humiliated, and hopeless, which I just hate that defense so much, to be like, oh, poor Dan, he was just betrayed and hurt by, he murdered these two men. It's wild that, that was the take that his attorneys went with.
But on top of that, he resigned.
Right.
He started this ball rolling. They were coming after him to take his position. He literally said, I can't do this anymore. Right. And then said, just kidding. Let me try this again.
It's definitely a mess around and find out situation. He didn't like the find out part.
As the trial unfolded, his defense team worked tirelessly to reshape the narrative. Prosecutors painted Dan as a cold-blooded killer who had planned his actions, while the defense painted him as a man in crisis. The defense argued that Dan's downward spiral started in the summer of 1978 when he entered a state of severe depression, which resulted from chemical changes linked to an underlying mental illness. These symptoms were sleeplessness, loss of appetite, declining health, and stress that fed into his illness and created this unbreakable cycle. Dan had always been very health conscious, but now he was unraveling with the pressures of his role as a supervisor, as well as the financial strain he was under and all the political infighting. And they said he had reached his breaking point. They further argued that his decision to resign on November 10th was fueled by these mental health struggles and not due to financial difficulties, as he had claimed. They said his resignation was impulsive and that he didn't consult with his aides about it. And then his supporters pressured him to stay, and so he felt pressured, so he went to the mayor to ask for his job back. According to Dan, he and the mayor had an agreement that he would reinstate Dan to the board, but then suddenly there was a change of heart, and the mayor turned on him and claimed he never made any such promises. To Dan, this felt like a betrayal, and it was the final push that he said sent him over the edge. They explained that by the time November 26 rolled around, Dan White was really coming undone. The call he got from the reporter confirming that he would not be reinstated shook him up so much that he spent the night on the couch, hardly sleeping at all. The next morning when Dan called his aide, she told him that there were supporters at City Hall urging the mayor to reinstate him, but the mayor wouldn't accept these signatures. Dan allegedly didn't want to go down to City Hall, but eventually he agreed to go if his aide came and picked him up because his wife had taken their only car to work that morning, so he actually had no way to get there.
Dan's defense team worked to convince the jury that he did not commit premeditated murder, but had instead snapped under the weight of mental illness. They called several friends, acquaintances, and relatives to the stand, and each one painted a picture of a man who had once been honorable and disciplined, but had slowly fallen into this deep depression and this constant state of frustration. Dan's former aide talked about the changes that she personally saw in him. She said he had difficulty adjusting to the political process, and he became moody and withdrawn. He would cancel meetings, and he just generally seemed very depressed a lot of the time. She said that his healthy habits fell by the wayside, and he started swapping his healthy lunches for candy and junk food and sugary drinks. She said that this was actually very unusual for him. He had always been very physically fit and very health-minded, and so some of these behaviors really shocked her. And one example she gave, which I can see what she means after this example. She said there was a time when Dan had to give a speech to a potentially hostile crowd. They weren't sure how things were going to go, but he ended up winning them over and receiving a standing ovation. Dan should have been absolutely thrilled for this win. It was something they had been worried about, but instead of being happy, he looked pale, he looked exhausted, and he ended up asking his aide to run to the store and buy him donuts. And when she brought them back, she said he ate about 5 donuts in a matter of seconds and just seemed like very withdrawn and not all there in the moment. So his aide said she didn't really know what to think. It was just a very shocking thing for her to witness. Other friends of Dan also noticed these changes in his health and appearance, and some said he just wasn't the same guy that they knew before. Numerous mental health experts were called to testify, including a psychiatrist named Dr. Martin Blinder, and he told the jury that Dan was suffering from depression and overwhelming pressure, and that the stress had impaired his ability to think clearly. Dr. Blinder said he lacked the normal mental process for premeditation, malice, and intent. The doctor testified that Dan had just snapped, and he even cited Dan's sugar addiction as a possible significant factor in this violent outburst. This is wild. He used a study where career criminals were taken off of high sugar diets and put on healthier meal plans, and allegedly their criminal behavior disappeared, which I found very interesting. I want to know more about this study. There's a lot of questions I have about that. Dr. Blinder said, quote, "Large quantities of junk food, high in sugar and preservatives, can precipitate antisocial and even violent behavior in susceptible individuals." Okay, so basically, there is science that shows, like, especially in children, right? They say, like, if your child is struggling with things like ADHD or, things like that, having trouble in school focusing, they do say that changing your diet to not include as much sugar, which obviously makes sense. Sugar is not good for any of us, right? To just beat our brains on sugar nonstop. So that obviously makes a lot of sense, where you can say, like, okay, cutting out sugar might improve some impulsive behaviors or certain types of behaviors that go with different things, especially, like, I'm using kids as an example because that's the most common one that you hear people saying, switch your kid's diet, which I'm not saying. I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm just saying that I get the, like, correlation that they're trying to create here with this, but you're losing me on sugar addiction will make you murder people. Like, that's where I'm like,
Well, then there's a lot more, first of all, murders that would take place.
Right.
And, I don't see this as being the
reason. Right, exactly. So this doctor, though, also cited Dan's growing stress levels and his fixation on being reappointed as the only way he'd be able to save himself, full stop. That's the only way he'd be able to save himself from all these things that were going on. So there were also several other experts that testified that Dan was suffering from severe depression and mental illness, and that he did not premeditate or deliberately kill anyone.
Prosecutors, though, much like most of you listening, weren't buying this. They had their own psychiatrist testify that Dan was moderately depressed, but not clinically so. And more importantly, he did have the mental capacity to premeditate a murder. Dr. Levi's assessment was that Dan had acted with full awareness of his actions. They asked if Dr. Levi was familiar with the junk food theory presented by the defense, and he said that he wasn't aware of any prevailing psychiatric opinion that high sugar and preservative diets are significantly linked to any type of mental illness. what's being called the Twinkie defense, had no scientific basis, according to the prosecutors. I know a different Twinkies defense, like if I don't get Twinkies,
right.
I could be a real problem around here. Of course, at this point, it's up to the jury to decide. Was Dan guilty of premeditated first-degree murder, or did he have reduced mental capacity due to an array of circumstances that he was facing? If they had reasonable doubt that Dan was able to premeditate, deliberate, or reflect on his actions, then they could not convict him of first-degree murder. If they had reasonable doubt that he could form malice or intent, then he couldn't be convicted of first or second-degree murder. If the jury found that Dan's actions were the result of impulse caused by mental illness, then they had to consider whether he was truly capable of forming the mental state needed for murder or voluntary manslaughter.
I would be a terrible juror. That's too many rules. That's too many things to think about.
I know. I need a top two. That's it.
Right. I can't do
2 options.
Right. That's too many rules. All right. So as we were saying, the jury did have a lot of options, and they took their time weighing them all. They deliberated for a total of 36 hours over a period of 6 days before finally returning with a verdict. Dan White was found not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of second-degree murder, and he was found guilty on 2 counts of manslaughter with gun enhancements added to both of those charges.
Unreal.
Absolutely unreal. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent, probably because people literally couldn't, what is there to even say? That's crazy. Like, I imagine people were just like, what's happening here?
Looking for their Twinkies to help them out.
Yeah.
I need one.
The observers just could not believe that Dan had walked right into City Hall and executed 2 elected officials in broad daylight, and he was only convicted of 2 counts of manslaughter. The DA was also stunned and disappointed. He said it was the wrong decision and that the jury was just overwhelmed by emotions and did not sufficiently analyze the evidence. I also feel like those instructions were very confusing and made you, like, I would be like, well, I don't know, especially the last one where he said, even if you think he did this out of impulse due to mental illness, then you have, like, I don't know, was he capable? I mean, I get it, but I feel like you're confusing me at that point, because it's like, I might think that he's guilty of murder, but now you've confused me into thinking, well, maybe he's not, like, legally so, and I just feel like all of that was unclear. Of course, Dan's defense celebrated the win. They claimed that Dan was, filled with remorse and said that he was actually in a very bad mental condition just due to all these things that were going on. And of course, he is allegedly suffering from depression and mental illness. So outside the courtroom, the city of San Francisco was absolutely furious, and many city officials publicly condemned the verdict. Within 1 hour of the verdict being announced, the streets of San Francisco erupted with a crowd of 3,000 angry protesters who gathered and marched towards City Hall. This time it was not a silent, peaceful protest. No, when they got there, the protesters smashed panes of glass and really just thrashed at the front doors until the police eventually got involved and stormed the crowd. There was tear gas being used. There were cars being set on fire, windows being smashed out, sirens wailing everywhere. Complete chaos in San Francisco. And things still were not even over quite yet, because the judge still had to decide exactly what Dan's sentence would be. Under the law, he faced a minimum of 5 years in prison and, get this, a maximum of 7 years and 8 months.
Unreal.
We're talking about the murder of 2 people. So the judge was taking a look at a few aggravating circumstances and a few mitigating circumstances to help him in making this decision about what the sentence would be. So the aggravating circumstances that they were looking at were that 1, the crime involved great violence and bodily harm. 2, Dan was armed with and used a weapon. And 3, the crime involved multiple victims. The mitigating circumstances that the judge was considering were that 1, Dan had no prior criminal record. 2, he was suffering from a mental or physical condition that significantly reduced his culpability. And 3, he voluntarily acknowledged his wrongdoing before his arrest.
So on July 3rd, 1979, the judge handed down his decision. Dan White would serve the maximum sentence of 7 years and 8 months in state prison. The details of that sentence outraged the city even further, though, because the judge said that for the killing of Mayor Moscone, Dan was sentenced to 4 years, plus 2 additional years for using a firearm. For killing Harvey Milk, Dan received just 1 year plus an additional 8 months for the use of a firearm. With parole, Dan would be eligible for release in less than 5 years.
Crazy.
The judge acknowledged the brutality of the crimes and said they involved maximum violence and admitted that 4 years for voluntary manslaughter was not an adequate punishment. Despite receiving such a light sentence, Dan still wasn't satisfied, and he appealed his conviction on the grounds that the judge had made legal errors when deciding his sentence. I will never get over people that appeal when they got a sweetheart deal on
Literally,
something.
Just do your 5 years and shush.
Be quiet. Yeah. So he claimed that the trial court wrongly used the same fact twice, which was his use of a firearm, to justify giving him the maximum term for killing the mayor and for adding firearm enhancements to both of his sentences.
I don't see why they wouldn't do that. Like, you used a gun both times, like in both murders. I don't get how.
Right.
There's no grounds for that. In my opinion, I would be like, what is this nonsense? Get this off my desk.
You also brought 10 bullets, so you could have had 10 guns. It didn't really matter. So Dan also argued that the judge didn't properly consider the mitigating factors. The Attorney General argued that Dan had no right to fight back and to appeal because he had the opportunity to object at his sentencing hearing, and he didn't. The Attorney General said if Dan truly felt there was an error, they would have spoken up right then. But now, it was too late. In the end, the appeals court upheld Dan's sentence, but even still, he wouldn't serve much time. On January 6, 1984, after serving just 5 years, Dan White walked out of prison and began a 1-year probation sentence. He was required to stay in Los Angeles and report to his parole officer once a week.
Dan kept a low profile after his release. He never expressed public remorse, but he had shattered the city of San Francisco with his actions. But things he had done were eating away at him. Less than 2 years after leaving prison on October 22nd, 1985, Dan was found dead in the garage of his family home. He had died by suicide at the age of 39, leaving behind several notes, none of which mentioned the assassinations, though. It seemed like Dan had taken his secrets all the way to the grave until over a decade later in 1998, when a shocking truth came to light. Frank Falzon, who was the lead detective on the case, revealed that back in 1984, just shortly after Dan was released from prison, he privately confessed to Detective Falzon. Dan allegedly told him that he had lied throughout his trial and that the killings were premeditated, and he actually intended to kill 2 other people that day.
Oh my gosh!
He was apparently planning to murder supervisors Willie Brown and Carol Silver. He blamed them, as well as Harvey, for convincing the mayor not to reinstate him. And the only reason he said he did not go through with killing those 2 people is because he ran out of bullets. After Dan confessed this information, the police decided that they would stay silent about it. At this point, right, Dan's already been in the news a lot. He's already gone to trial. He's already served his time. He's being released from prison. So at this time, the police are like, let's not send the city into an uproar by saying that this guy was planning on killing 2 others, which also blows my mind that
actually
4 years is the only time for manslaughter. Like, it's wild to me. Like that,
all of it,
right? Mm-hmm. But of course, there's double jeopardy, so he can't be tried. He can't be charged with anything for admitting that that was truly what his plan was. So the full truth had stayed buried for nearly 15 years after these assassinations, and really only came to light after this detective decided to come forward and say, "Oh yeah, by the way, this was the truth." That he said.
Unreal, because I would think just that he was planning to kill the other 2, they could have charged him with something else against them.
Or let them know. Like,
that's what I was going to say.
That's wild. And if they didn't, then I have questions about that. I don't know that they did or did not. But if I was those other 2 people, those other 2 supervisors, I would be terrified knowing that this guy got out of prison after 5 years. Like, he's probably still mad.
Absolutely. Yeah. So according to the Milk Foundation, Harvey's inspiring life has been the subject and inspiration for Academy Award-winning films like 1984's The Times of Harvey Milk and 2009's feature film Milk, as well as operas, books, plays, music, awards, proclamations, and an annual official governmental day of recognition. In 2009, Harvey Milk posthumously received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama. His nephew Stuart Milk accepted it on Harvey's behalf. In 2009, Harvey's nephew Stuart and Harvey's campaign manager, Ann Cronenberg, established the Harvey Milk Foundation. The foundation seeks to inspire individuals, communities, and organizations to carry on Harvey's values and a timeless vision for a better world.
Wow, Melissa, what did you think of this story?
I knew the story, but I did not ever know the result. I did not know somebody only got a couple years
that's
for
wild.
this. Fully just my assumption, because I'm thinking it was very clearly a premeditated murder, but I just assumed that's what had happened. So it's unreal to find out that that's all it was. And not only that, that he went and confessed later and said, by the way, BT dubs, I actually planned this and just ran out of bullets.
Yeah. No, honestly, it's wild to me that he only got such a small amount of time, because I guess I just assumed that if you murder a public official, you're probably going to have the book thrown at you. Like, I feel like
I would have thought that too.
Right. Like, so that's also why it was shocking to me. I'm like, this guy killed the mayor. Like, it's wild. You would think that the legal system would like rally together to do everything to get you as much as you can. And then I have questions too, because in other cases, I feel like, I guess it is all set by the law. It's all outlined by what sentence you can give someone.
Sure.
But why do I feel like there's been cases where a judge has gone against, or maybe in some states it's just a recommendation and not like the actual law says that you can only give this much of time? Because that's where I'm like, yeah, like a judge, I feel like, I don't know. That's also questionable. Should they have the power to say that this isn't enough for this person in this case? That is why they're a judge. You know, that is what we're trusting them to do, things like that, to like bring a human element of like common sense to certain things, which is obviously very hard with legal stuff, because it does have to be, there has to be a paper trail. There has to be justification for everything. But I just thought it was wild, like killing the mayor and somebody on the board of supervisors, that it would even be possible that you could walk with manslaughter.
The fact that it was somebody within the board is also wild. I've been watching, like, my sister has her local elections. I know everything going on in her town. I watch all of her videos, but you see people come up there heated and saying, they're 3 minutes. It is scary. And like, you have to, check. They have to go through security and all that stuff. So for it to be somebody that's like, quote unquote, on your team, or, like you guys are all serving together, is really like unexpected. And it's wild. Yeah. So this was really a journey for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you for listening. We will be back next week. Same time, same place, new story.
Have a great week.
Bye.